Okay, hello everybody. Let's get started. Thank you all for joining this webinar on the federal and ACT budgets. My name is Simon Copland. I'm the Executive Director at the Conservation Council ACT, and I'll be hosting this webinar today. The purpose of the webinar is to really provide a briefing on what's happened in the federal and ACT budgets, which have been released in May and June this year respectively. Particularly with a focus on what's been invested or not invested in our environment and climate in both of these budgets. So what I will do is share my screen. I've got some slides to share with you all that we'll run through. What we'll do is I'll go through a bit of a briefing, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end and comments at the end. So if you just give me 1 second. Now, hopefully everyone can see those slides there, what's in the budget for nature. So let me know if you can't, as I said, what we're doing today is having a briefing on what's in the budget for nature for both the federal and ACT budgets. And we'll be looking at them sort of respectively throughout the webinar. So I'd first like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging here in the ACT, meeting on Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Ngero land, and respect all elders in this region and across Australia, and acknowledge that questions, I always think that there's really important questions around how we engage with First Nations people, but also engage in reconciliation. And it's often very important in these kinds of conversations, particularly around environmental protection and caring for country. And so we must always be considering how we engage in reconciliation and handing land back as part of all of the work we do. So it's very important to have that acknowledgement at the start of this presentation. So to get going, today's webinar, what we'll be looking at is three key things. So first of all, I have a breakdown of the federal budget that was released in May this year. Look at, in the context of the federal budget, our 1% for Nature campaign and what we're asking for, particularly at a federal level. Then we're going to have a look at the ACT budget breakdown and go into some detail about the specific programs that are being funded in the ACT budget for nature. Talk a bit about at the end about what's missing. We could probably talk longer about that particular question, but we'll cover on some key things, and then we've got a Q&A at the end. So let's get started. So the big picture of the federal budget. So the federal budget, to put it quite bluntly, was extremely disappointing for nature. Funding for nature conservation has fallen, while investment in speeding up environmental approvals has been supercharged, and I'll talk about that a bit soon. So analysis from the Pew Charitable Trust, who we work with quite closely, found that the proportion of funding allocated to on-ground nature programs has remained at 0.06% of the budget, or just $1 for nature out of every $1,667. Most disappointingly, the total commitment for the 2026 financial year is only $496 million in nature preservation, which is compared to an actual spend of $518 million in the 2025-26 year. So when you account for inflation in real terms, this is a 9% reduction in nature spending from previous financial years. And this is what we're talking about here in particular is spending of on-the-ground preservation works and restoration and management work. So it's really on-the-ground nature works. This is not as much about the staffing and things like that policy work. In saying that, there's also been a decline in further in the future years. Sorry, when it comes to nature funding, there's been a decline in future years, falling to $323 million in 28-29. Which, after allowing for inflation, this is an almost halving of on-the-ground biodiversity investment, which would reduce nature's share to less than 0.04% of the federal budget. In addition to this, overall resources for the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, Water is also falling. So this is staffing, people working in policy areas. There's an 11% reduction in deep environmental resourcing, which includes staff salaries and operations, and a 21% reduction in administered spending compared to the last financial years, which covers specific programs, grants, and benefits. So unfortunately, the federal budget had big cuts to nature. And this is one of the kind of, I think, many untold stories of nature at this point of time of the budget, when there's been a lot of focus on tax reform. So what is there in the budget? The federal budget, when it comes to nature protection, really has 4 key programs that they fund. And as we said, there's on-ground biodiversity programs is about $496 million, which is lower than the previous $518 million spend. So there's these 4 key programs. So there's the Saving Our Species program, which plays a critical role in protecting threatened species and conserving their habitats. There's been allocated $99.6 million to extend this for an additional 2 years. We've been advocating for funding to reach at least 1% of the federal budget. And we recommend that funding like this really needs to be extended for long periods. So an extension for an only additional 2 years continues to put this program sort of on a short-term basis rather than considering it an extended long-term part of the budget. The second program the government funds is the Australian Bushland Program. And this is a relatively new program that they have funded, that they announced prior to the last federal election. And was related to the Australia's 30 by 30 conservation commitment. So that's a commitment to have 30% of land and 30% of water preserved in some sort of nature reserve or other form of protection by 2030. The Australian Bushland Program was designed to invest in this to prevent habitat loss and to prevent irreversible damage to important ecosystems. It's a federally administered program with funding decisions primarily the responsibility of the Commonwealth Government, but they have engaged in programs where they're granting to state and territory governments through this program. The ACT government has bid for part of the funding as part of the Australian Bushland Program, but has so far been unsuccessful. Current funding is projected at approximately $47 to $50 million annually over the next 5 years. There's a total projected funding of approximately $237 million, which falls around $13 million short of the original $250 million commitment. And when you take into account inflation, this further reduces the real value of this investment. We welcomed the release of this program, the announcement of this program, but we think that $250 million is just nowhere near enough. And the fact that the government isn't even possibly going to spend all of that amount of money is disappointing. So we recommend restoring the funding shortfall and ensuring long-term funding certainty to strengthen land conservation outcomes and support achievement for the 30 by 30 target. The next program that the federal government really invests in is the Nature Heritage Trust, which is a long-standing environmental program that's funded conservation and sustainable land management initiatives across Australia for more than 30 years. The program supports practical on-ground actions to protect and restore biodiversity, promote sustainable agriculture, conserve wetlands, and support Indigenous land and sea management. And it contributes to the recovery of threatened species, habitat restoration, and improved environmental outcomes in both rural and regional Australia. Unfortunately, current budget projections indicate that funding will decline from 28-29 onwards, representing an estimated 19% reduction compared to the 2025-26 funding levels. So again, an area where we're seeing cuts by the federal government. And such a decline may limit the effectiveness of long-term conservation projects and reduce certainty for organisations. So we're advocating for a sustained increase in funding to this program to ensure continued progress toward biodiversity conservation outcomes. And that the funding commitments, again, move from short-term cycles to a minimum of 5 years with a preference for 5 to 10-year funding horizons so that we have certainty around these programs. The final program that the federal government really funds in sort of biodiversity protection, nature protection, is in marine conservation programs. So the federal government does invest heavily in marine conservation, but it's primarily focused around the Great Barrier Reef, while other nationally significant marine ecosystems receive little support. So, for example, the Great Southern Reef, which runs from Brisbane to Perth, is globally unique, with around 70% of its species found nowhere else in the world, and contributes approximately $12 billion annually to the Australian economy. Yet this marine ecosystem receives little federal funding. Funding for the strengthening of the Great Barrier Reef through stewardship and leadership programs will average $100 million per year over the next 4 years, which again is a reduction in previous funding levels. But outside the Great Barrier Reef, only $5.6 million has been allocated to all other Australian marine parks over the next 2 years. So the Great Barrier Reef is receiving $100 million per year, which is still a reduction. And the rest of Australia receives $5.6 million a year, which is just a really tiny amount. In addition to this, the Maugean skate is the only threatened marine species that receives dedicated federal funding, despite Australia having 22 additional threatened marine fish species listed under the EPBC Act. And again, it's ironic that the Maugean skate is receiving such funding when the federal government specifically changed nature laws to allow salmon farming to continue in their habitat, which is definitely harming that species. And there are several marine conservation and restoration programs that are scheduled to conclude by June 30, reducing support for ongoing conservation efforts. So we recommend in this area that we increase marine conservation funding beyond the Great Barrier Reef to better support nationally significant marine ecosystems, to expand investment in threatened marine species recovery programs and marine park management, and to provide longer-term funding certainty for coastal restoration. And this is a kind of ongoing trend of what we're recommending, which is this increasing certainty. So this is just a summary of the key projects that the federal government spends money on in terms of nature conservation. And you can see the trends that are happening here, where we're seeing declines in funding across all 4 of these programs and a lack of certainty into the future, which is a really disappointing situation that we're in. The next part of the federal budget puzzle that is also extremely worrying is the spending on bilateral agreements and streamlining approvals. So one of the important changes to the EPBC Act that occurred at the end of last year was increasing capacity for the federal government to enter into bilateral agreements to streamline approvals for projects. And what that means is the government can enter into an agreement with a state and territory government to allow that state and territory government to assess projects within their geographic area, as long as they meet federal guidelines. The budget has allocated $153.5 million over 4 years to progress bilateral agreements with states and territories that would see decision-making under the EPBC Act handed to these governments, as well as to enhance the use of AI in environmental approvals. So we're seeing the government actively wanting to use AI as a way to assess projects and approve them. We know, for example, that the ACT government has confirmed that they're progressing a bilateral agreement with the Commonwealth. The federal government has said that they want to have bilateral agreements done with all states and territories by the end of the year. In the ACT, that means we'll need to progress an offsets policy and restoration contributions system to align with the federal government programs. And in other states and territories, they've got to do some work as well. What we're really concerned about is that this is an extremely dangerous opportunity for states and territories to accelerate rather than to stop nature destruction. Devolution gives rise to potential conflicts of interest, particularly in states like Western Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland, where it's often the states and territories who are the backers of destructive projects, or are actively undermining or have a strong interest in these. And we see these in places like WA, where there are significant investment or significant connections between the state government and gas companies. We believe that matters of national environmental significance should be considered at the highest level to ensure the federal government is actively working to meet its global obligations and continues to be held to account for the state of Australia's environment. And this bilateral agreements is really a way to hand off accountability to somebody else. And we are particularly concerned that the new national environmental standards, which will underpin all of this, are not helping. The draft standards were released for public consultation. And under this, it's also possible for bilateral assessments and approval agreements to accredit state and territory laws by only meeting a series of weak, high-level principles. This means that the more detailed outcomes and objectives set out in the standards can be ignored if the high-level principles are met. So we're seeing some real risk here in the way that this federal government is engaging in this process. So that's kind of a bit of an overview of what's happened with the federal government, with the federal budget. It is unfortunately a pretty depressing scene at this point in time. What we're calling for, and this is one of the reasons that we at the Conservation Council have been engaged in this 1% for Nature campaign, which is part of an alliance of environmental organisations working to ensure that Australia meets its 30 by 30 land and commitments. And we argue that we can't meet this 30 by 30 commitments without a significant increase in funding for nature in the country. Without the funding, we will be protecting land for it to then become degraded or for it to fall apart, and that is not what a really good outcome in the long run. So we're calling for at least 1% of the federal budget to be invested in protecting nature. Currently, the average spending is around 0.1% of the total budget. You can see it at a tiny little sliver in that pie graph, although it's also, as we've said, it's decreasing. The Biodiversity Council analysis found that $26 billion of the budget is actually directed towards environmental harm through fossil fuel extraction and mining projects. We could shift all of that money into nature protection and would have a significant impact on our nature. So investing in 1% could help prevent extinctions, could recover threatened species, restore degraded landscapes, protect at least 30% of our land and sea ecosystems, and boost productivity. It's a really basic ask and one that we are continuing to push for. To give a bit of a sense of this, the Biodiversity Council co-chief councillor Professor Hugh Possington from the University of Queensland says that monitoring for the last 25 years has shown that threatened species in Australia have been declining by at least 2% per year. If Australia's GDP was declining at 2% every year for 25 years, there would be a national outcry. If GDP declines for just 2 quarters, we call it a recession. If we invested just 1% of the budget in nature, we could stop that decline by 2030. It's a really basic ask, but one that could have a really big impact. And there's ways at the bottom of this screen where you can get involved. We're meeting local federal MPs to talk to them about this ask and to demand their commitment to 1% for nature. And would be great for you to come and get involved. You can email us, you can email Sylvia or Aveen there to figure out how to get involved. So that's the story for the federal budget. Now let's move to the ACT budget. The ACT budget, I think there's some mixed news, but we have had some good wins, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done. So a quick overview. What did we ask for in the ACT budget this year? So we had some very specific targeted asks for the ACT budget, noting the fiscal state that the territory is in and what might be achievable. So we wanted to have funding extensions for terminating programs with the City and Environment Department, particularly the Thermally Assisted Aerial Control Program, the Biosecurity Response Team and Fisheries Conservation Officer. We wanted resourcing to implement the new draft ACT Nature Conservation Strategy and the future ACT Climate Strategy. We wanted long-term operational funding certainty for community-based organisations, environmental organisations, and immediate funding to deliver the ACT government's outstanding 2024 election commitments, including increased funding for weed management and additional ranger positions. There has been some wins. So there was a 29.8 million, in total, there's a 29.8 million package of investment for environment, climate action, water efficiency upgrades, household energy support. You'll note in the chart that there is a section that is 3% of the budget, that is environment, sustainable development and climate change, and that's $257 million. Only a small sliver of that actually goes to nature protection. A lot of that money goes into broader planning and urban development measures, which is considered under the sustainable development section. So while it says 3%, we're not seeing that level of investment in nature and in climate here in the ACT. But so we've got a $257 million overall in that sort of bucket, but really about $29.8 million package for the more targeted work on environment, climate action, water efficiency upgrades, household energy support. Another thing that we're also seeing is a reduction in staffing levels in the City and Environment Directorate, which is the core area that does environmental protection. It's going to go down from 2,654 full-time equivalent staff in 26-27, which is a decrease of 40 full-time equivalent staff. So let's go into some more specifics of all of this. And I think I've just seen a question about whether I can provide these statistics, and I'm happy to do so. I'll share it after the webinar. So biodiversity and waterways spending. So a couple of new announcements. So the government announced $940,000 over 3 years on community environment initiatives. This includes a new community weeds grant, which is $150,000 over 3 years. So it's only $50,000 a year, but it's a new grant to support weeding in the community. Nowhere near enough as what is needed, but we do welcome this new grant. They've uplifted the ACT Environment Grant. So this is an additional money of $150,000 over 3 years, so an additional $50,000 a year on top of the existing ACT Environment Grants. I was, to be quite frank, worried that they were going to cut these grants entirely. So to see that uplift is positive. We're happy to see that. They've committed for $100,000 over 2 years to continue their Volunteers Conference, which many of you may be familiar with. The ACT Environmental Volunteers Conference began in 2023, has been a successful event celebrating our volunteer groups, environmental volunteer groups. And so we're really thrilled that the government is continuing to support that event. And in addition, they've also invested in $540,000 over 3 years in 3 community groups: ACT Wildlife, Landcare ACT, and the National Parks Association, all member groups of the Conservation Council. And we're really delighted to see that additional funding go to those groups. A really important thing that we've seen in the budget is the biosecurity response funding. So the ACT government has a biosecurity response team, which was funded, but had funding expire at the end of this financial year, and we were really worried about that team. It's really important in responding to biosecurity issues here in the Territory, new invasive weeds, new invasive species, for example. And that has been funded for over the 4 years, so been provided longer term funding. That will strengthen our preparedness and response capabilities to growing biosecurity threats. And we see the real risk of the bird flu happening at the moment. So this is really important that we continue to have that funding. In addition, there's continuing funding, and this is just continuing funding, nothing new, for land management, which is $13.3 million over 2 years, which is a broad bucket of money for the City Environment Directorate to undertake land management activities, including ecological and mapping work, nature conservation activities, fisheries compliance, caring for country partnerships, and a review of the ACT environmental offsets policy. In the waterways section, we have a water efficiency program which is $11.9 million over 2 years. This funding has been fully offset from within existing resources, and is not really new money being spent by the government. It's likely unspent money that was rolled over from last year's budget, but we're happy to see it go into water efficiency programs. The ACT government received a $58 million grant from the Commonwealth government in 2023-24 to design and implement initiatives to recover 6.36 gigalitres of water per year to be held by the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and we think this is likely where that money has come from. But it includes replacement of inefficient household tapware, improving irrigation systems in sports grounds, and water management activities at businesses, schools, and government facilities. There's also education for consumers and for the investigation of regulatory changes for new builds to increase water efficiency. There's also investment in Lake Tuggeranong water quality improvements of $2.71 million over 4 years. And again, this is a measure that is partially offset from existing resources, which is likely of a rollover of unspent funds from last year's budget allocated to the Tuggeranong project. So that's $350,000 of this is likely rolled over. This is part of an existing ACT Healthy Waterways program, which is delivering a 10-year plan to improve water quality in Lake Tuggeranong, which I think is really important. It includes additional street sweeping to decrease leaf litter running into the lake from stormwater drains, reducing the cost of maintenance and cleaning existing pollutant traps. They're also undertaking a trial of anti-algal technologies. There's also some work on behaviour change for households to help reduce practices that harm water quality. Climate. So climate, you may have seen the ACT government do a media release and sort of focus investment on climate. They announced a $10 million package of climate over 4 years. We sort of really count that as a $940,000 package because they're including the $60,000 package for environment groups, community groups that we mentioned earlier. But it's a $9.6 million package. Sorry, not yes, it's a $9.3 million package over 4 years for climate in the ACT. So there's two group programs there that go to community organisations. So there's a commitment of $600,000 over 3 years for community climate change mitigation and adaptation programs or projects, and details of how this funding will be made available and what it's specifically for to occur in the first quarter of the financial year. So we'll find out more information about that over the next 3 to 4 months. There's also $325,000 over 2 years for community services organisations to manage climate risks and undertake adaptation planning. And that's a program that's being run through the ACT Council of Social Services. They had a pilot program where they worked with community organisations to develop plans for climate adaptation plans. So what to do, how to continue services running, for example, in the case of a bushfire or a heat wave. And they have continued that funding and actually increased that funding to make it more of a sustained program, which is one that we really support. In addition to that, so that's $600,000 and $325,000. That's about $1 million out of that $10 million investment. At the moment, it's unclear exactly what the remainder of that money will be spent on, that $10 million package, and whether it will be spent on the ground or internally within the directorate. We know some of that money will be spent on finalising the ACT government's climate strategy, which has taken some time to get finalised, and we've had some critiques of. But we're expecting that to be finalised in the next few months. So we don't think all of that $10 million or $9 million will be spent on that money, on that project, but some of it will. But the budget outlook does give us some ideas about where the rest of that money could be spent. They've identified that the money could be spent on identifying further ways to address effects of increased heat, further reducing emissions in areas such as transport, which would be a really positive thing to be spending the money on, and continuing to improve environmental management practices to support long-term sustainability of natural systems facing pressure from climate change. So they're talking more about how we can support natural systems to adapt to climate change, noting that there will be significant changes. So we'll be keeping a close eye on this. Further investment in the climate strategy, and really investing in policies on the ground was a key ask in our budget submission, and something that we've certainly heard very strongly from the community during the consultation on the climate strategy, that people are tired of plans and strategies, but no on-the-ground action. And so we're really hoping that money goes to on-the-ground action rather than to more policy work, and we'll be sort of keeping a close eye on how they intend to invest this money and what's the best use of it. In addition to this, the government announced that they're continuing a number of important climate programs to help reduce our emissions. So they're continuing the Home Energy Support Program and Renters Home Energy Program of $2.36 million over 3 years. The Renters Home Energy Program is a free program available to any person renting a home within the ACT, providing online tools or an in-person home energy assessment to educate on ways to save energy bills and make homes more comfortable. And the Home Energy Support Program provides rebates of up to $5,000 to eligible low-income homeowners to help with the cost of installing energy-efficient products. So these two programs are really important programs to continue supporting homeowners and renters in upgrading to more energy efficiency technologies, to moving away from gas, these types of things, and we support the continuation of these programs. The government is also continuing on the Sustainable Household Scheme, and they've also lifted the loan caps on the Sustainable Household Scheme to $20,000. So it previously was $15,000, but for new participants, it'll be now $20,000, which gives households greater capacity to invest in energy-efficient upgrades or products. You could now, for example, purchase a used EV with $20,000, and so that means that you can now have a greater capacity to participate in that scheme. In addition, after lots of pushing, the government has accepted that from 2026, September 2026, that they'll add electric cargo bikes will be included in the scheme. Look, we think that they should be really including all electric bikes or bikes in general, but this is a good step forward in promoting active travel, including electric cargo bikes in the scheme. We're also really delighted that the Sea Change e-bike library has been extended for a further 2 years. Was really, again, one of our key budget asks. It's a program that's really important for promoting active travel, encouraging people to getting onto e-bikes, and it has seen quite a lot of success. And so we're glad to see that program has been extended. On transport, there's a few things that have been announced. Lower monthly public transport fare caps for tertiary students. You may have seen that the ACT government announced lower caps for monthly fare caps for all people. They halved them recently, so that means that if you're taking public transport regularly, you'll hit a cap much earlier and then be on free public transport. And they're going $614,000 of revenue to reduce the monthly fare cap for tertiary students from 40 to 30 paid trips as part of a 12-month trial. They've also invested $313,000 over 3 years to build a bike path in Hall that connects Hall to Gold Creek, which is a great project. And $800,000 for the Belconnen to City Transitway design, which is funding for detailed design for improvements to public transport corridor between Belconnen and the city. Now, these are all great investments, but I will say if you look at them in the scheme of things, they're very minor when it comes to what's required to reduce our transport emissions, particularly when we look at this in the context of how much the ACT government spends on road duplications. We're spending over $100 million on the duplication of William Hovell Drive, and similar to the duplication of Athlone Drive. Athlone Drive is particularly egregious in the sense that it's connecting Woden to Tuggeranong, but we know that population is declining in Tuggeranong at the moment. So we're not seeing an increase in demand, but we are seeing the government invest in road duplications. Now, if you took the about $100 million that's being spent on that and invested that in more active travel, we would see a significant uplift in our bike path network. So while an investment of $313,000 in a bike path for Hall is great, we could be seeing a lot more, but government decisions are really focused still on roads and road duplications. They make an announcement about active travel, but we're not seeing real mass investment in that. One path in this budget is simply just not enough. Some other things that are missing. One of the things that we've been asking for continuing to ask for is Parks and Conservation Service ranging funding. The government has committed to increasing the number of infill park rangers by 10. This was following a confidence to supply agreement with Tom Emerson MLA, which would be an overall increase in park rangers of 33%. That still hasn't happened. We have heard that some of those positions may come from the voluntary redundancy process that's happening within the City Environment Directorate at the moment. That what they're looking to do is have voluntary redundancies from policy people, ideally not within the environment section, and that money would be directed to on-the-ground staff members, so park rangers in particular. So we're hoping to maybe see some of those people be employed over the next 12 months. But in saying that, if we don't see that occur, we'll be definitely pushing for this to be for these to be fully funded in the next budget. It really should have happened by now. We also know that the PCF, the Parks and Conservation Services, are going to absorb many of the functions of managing the new nature conservation network and priority conservation areas proposed in the new draft nature conservation strategy, and we're really not seeing the investment needed to see that really be implemented. The draft nature conservation strategy is quite a bold strategy, but it needs to be properly resourced, and a big part of that proper resourcing is people on the ground. And at the moment, we're just really not seeing that occur anywhere near enough. I should have put a question mark after the next one because we're still trying to figure out what's happening with the Office of Nature Conservation's Compliance Officer, which is a fisheries officer. That was a position that was held for a couple of years and had great success in increasing compliance around our waterways, around fishing. But we're still a bit unclear about whether that role is being extended or not, and we're trying to figure that out. And I've got to speak to some people within the directorate to figure that out. So there's a question mark there about how that position is being funded and the longevity of that. There's really still a lot of work around resourcing to implement the nature conservation strategy and to support the development of outstanding plans and policies, partnerships with Ngunnawal community and on-the-ground work to protect our nature. We're seeing a lack of investment in significant public and active transport measures. In the midst of a fuel crisis, the budget includes little to incentivise mode shift towards public and active transport. It really, we're not really seeing the kind of investment needed to transition our transport away from private vehicles. We know that transport is now the biggest emitter in the ACT, the biggest direct emitter. It is a huge concern. It's growing emissions from the transport sector. And we also know, and the government has said this many times, that we cannot rely on a one-to-one replacement of combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. We need to have mode shift, and we're just not seeing the investment needed to make that happen. And we're still missing further details on what the climate strategy funding will be spent on. Will it go to internal resourcing for the City Environment Directorate, or on-the-ground grants or funding from community groups, or just on-the-ground project work to reduce our emissions? We don't really know, and we're looking forward to seeing more details of that. Okay, I feel like I've definitely spoken enough. So what I will do, questions, I want to open up the floor for questions. You can also get involved to support our 1% for Nature campaign, which is one that we really are pushing to really increase investment in nature spending, both federally and locally. So there's ways you can get involved in that. But in the meantime, I will stop sharing and open up the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Gordon, I can see that you've got a question in the chat, which is, apart from work around Lake Chuggerong in terms of waterways, is there any funding for naturalisation of other urban waterways, e.g. Sullivan's Creek? The short answer to that is no. The government has already backed away from investment in Sullivan's Creek. That occurred about a year ago now, that they sort of backed away from that following questions from Tom Emerson, MLA. They cited that it was going to cost upwards of $300 million. They never really released that data, but they've said that they don't believe it's worth the spend. We also have had some interesting conversations around Yarralumla Creek, particularly with groups like the Woden Community Council, because of the recent flooding that occurred there. And if you go around Chifley, Curtin, if you go around that area, you'll see the damage that's still being done. And we understand that their government is going to rebuild that creek exactly as it was. We think that's an opportunity to renaturalise parts of that creek, but they're not going to be doing that. It's just going to be sort of a like-for-like replacement. So at the moment, yeah, pretty disappointing and a bunch of stuff on the waterways front, because there's some opportunities there, but the government's not taking them. Any other questions? John?
Based on the overall budget, I mean, we'd like a lot more, but how much room do you think that the government got to move? I mean, what areas would we say need to be cut in order to improve the actions for nature? Because obviously we want this to happen, but they're always going to come back with the hard accountants type arguments. So do you see areas that we can improve?
Yeah, so I think in the ACT, there's small areas, which, I mentioned one, which is the amount of money we're spending on road duplications. some of the stuff, there is some bits and pieces of small programs here and there that, even some government ministers have acknowledged to me that, that they're often too scared to cut because it's, it's difficult. But I think that we have to do a bit more investigation on what could be cut here, or where things would need to be moved around. But roads is a very clear one for me. But in saying that, John, that's kind of the reason that we're targeting the 1% for Nature campaign at the federal government, because they have a lot more room to move. As I mentioned, they're investing billions in programs that are destroying nature. We're investing billions in AUKUS. There's plenty of federal government money going around, and we believe that they could direct all of those subsidies for fossil fuel companies to nature preservation, dole that out to states and territories, and that would really help particularly a territory like the ACT to have proper money to invest in nature. And it wouldn't be that difficult for them to do that. That's just a political choice for that to occur. So I think that the money pot, the levers are much stronger at the federal level, and through the bushland program, which they've already got, they could boost that by billions of dollars, and we'd have a lot more money going into nature preservation here in the territory.
Thanks.
Gary, I see, has a question. The Federal Department of Environment recently announced an EPA to start soon. Any thoughts on this? Gary, do you have anything you want to add to that, to any particular interests that you've got? If not, I'll answer as best I can.
Hi, Simon. Not really. I just heard it on the news, and I just thought it was much heralded at the start, but then I know it was cut back quite a bit from what it was originally announced, and I just have no idea whether it's actually a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah. Look, we supported the creation of an EPA to continue having kind of more independent assessments of environmental of projects and how they meet our environmental standards. That kind of takes away some of the political pressure that can be put on to ministers when they're making decisions on things like the Browse gas development. The issue we're seeing is that the government has announced that it is establishing that, while at the same time doing these bilateral agreements with states and territories, which means that we could see that it ends up not actually assessing anywhere near as much as it should be, because a lot of those assessments go back to the states and territories. And so while it's been very heralded, we're really concerned about how the government is implementing these laws and how they're sort of devolving themselves of any accountability or responsibility when it comes to assessing our nature, assessing projects in terms of the impact they're going to have on nature. And so, yeah, we have a bunch of concerns about something that probably could be really good, but it's not going to be as good as as it could be. Julia.
Yeah, hi guys. Sorry, I can't put my video on because my internet's a bit sketchy. I really strongly support the ranger positions, and I'm aware that, yeah, the part of the Emerson agreement, our local ranger in Belconnen Hills is still on a temporary contract, and really keen for her to stay on. And that's the case with a lot of park staffing is done on temporary arrangements. The 33% is, I believe, incorrect. It was based on a FOI based on just Canberra Nature Park staffing and not Molonglo, Googong, Namaji, Tid. I'm not sure.
No,
yeah. But yeah, I can send you deets on that. Because if you look at the broader 10 across the whole of ACT, you might just get one Canberra Nature Park North and one extra south, couple in Namaji. You spread them out. It's not a lot. I just wanted to also always remember that the rangers are only one class of staffing in parks, R1, 2 and 3. And then beyond that, above that, the technical officers, but there's also got a lot of general service officers. So what I generally push for is to support the implementation of the nature conservation strategy. They really do need workforce planning, which should include Office of Nature Conservation and BioSec, to really make sure they've got the staffing with the skills and capabilities to deliver on that. The rangers are really important, but they're not the only people we need. Rangers also, in terms of the weeds, volunteers do quite a small proportion. It's generally, blown out of proportion a bit. During COVID years, we did more percentage-wise, because rangers weren't allowed to go out in the field. It's very important, and they fill gaps. Surprisingly, the government staff themselves don't do heaps either. It's generally contractors, and they're really efficient because they're doing it 5 days a week. They've got the big trucks. So when we talk about staffing, that's great. That's really important, but we need money for contractors. That budget's just got to be cash. They do them. I think they'd probably, I can look at it's all online, but they probably do 80% is contractor money. Yeah. So just cold hard cash for that budget is critical.
Thanks, Julia. I think that's really good context and really useful. I'm not someone who I'm still getting my head around how all of this works on the ground, so I really appreciate that extra context. I think that generally what I agree with is what we need is money that goes into on the ground management, whatever that looks like. The ranger commitment from the confidence and supply agreement is one part of that still hasn't been funded. We keep pushing for it to be funded. But I think you're right that there's a broader part here about how we invest in on-the-ground management and all of the tools that are required for that, and all the people that are required for that.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of the biosecurity network proposal, that weed money needs to be prioritised across all 10 years, not just parks. That's the problem, as you well know.
Yep. Yeah, definitely agree with that.
Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Julia, for that. I've got another couple of comments in the chat. One from Dee, which is agree that we need more investment in off-road bike paths and priority bus lanes and better connecting bus networks and express buses. Currently no off-road bike path on Monera Highway, despite community asking for it. On one hand, government promises active travel and use of public transport, but continues to do road duplication instead. What can be done to change this discrepancy? Dee, I think the only thing that what we really need to do, when I speak, and I speak obviously as somebody who used to work at Pedal Power, which is a cycling advocacy organisation for a couple of years, and what the government will say to me, what the government said to me then and still says to me now when I raise these issues is that they support active travel, they support public transport, but there's particularly in the public service a real fear of community backlash about particularly anything that's disruptive. This is why we've never seen a off-road bike path built on Northbourne Avenue, because they see it as being too disruptive and that there'll be too much backlash. And so we've always been of the view that we need to continue campaigning and showing support for these initiatives. We know some of our member groups here, Pedal Power, Public Transport Canberra, Living Streets are doing a great job in doing that work of campaigning to government and to the community about the importance of these things. We just have to change the story to really convince the government to take some more leadership. Places around the world where we've seen real transition, real mode shift has been places where governments have shown leadership. So Paris, I'm thinking London, places like this, and where city leaders have taken some risks and have been found to be very supported in the long run. So just ongoing campaigning, I think, is really important. John, you've asked a question, has the ACT government addressed the question of AI data centres at all, either in terms of budget or otherwise? The short answer is no, not yet that I'm aware of. We do know that they have some people working on data centre policy within the City Environment Directorate. The issue here in the Territory is that this region has been identified by some as a potentially an area that could have data centres because of our climate. In particular, cooler climate means that you have to heat it less, but that brings us a bunch of risks around electricity usage, around water usage, these types of things. We've got some volunteers here in the Comms Council actively working on data centre policy in terms of what we would say would need to be requirements to have data centres built here, or if we would oppose them outright. We're still doing a bit of that research, so I don't have heaps to say on it just yet, except that we're concerned about it. You may have seen that there's actually been a number of data centres announced across Australia recently, and there was a proposal for a data centre to be built as part of a sort of industrial complex on Canberra Avenue that went through a development application process recently. That application has been at the moment rejected because it was going to impact Canberra grassland Elis dragon habitat. which is really great. But I think we're going to have a broader, it was a sort of signal to me that, you know, people are going to come and want to build data centers here. So we've got a bit more work to do on that to really understand it and to really be facing that, because I think there's a real risk. Gordon, you ask, is there ongoing funding for the Cons Council and the catchment groups who I understand were having to put in tenders for their funding? Thanks for that question, Gordon. So yes, the Cons Council, as well as Sea Change and the Canberra Environment Centre, we went through a tender for our funding. We 3 groups were all successful in that tender, and so we have funding for the next 4 years, with the potential of an extension for another 2 years. There was also a tender put out for funding associated with land care work, which is currently money that the catchment groups have. So they've had those contracts for a number of years now, and that's the Ginninderra, Molongo and Southern catchment groups. The announcement of who has received that funding has not been made yet. The funding has been put out for tender, but we do not know who will get that money. So the money is still going into the investment into land care work, but we just don't know who has received it. And we will hopefully know before the end of the financial year, which is coming around very soon. So we are here at the Cons Council, we have enough funding for at least 4 years, with a likely extension for 2 more after that. Any other questions? So we've only got 5 minutes left. Great. No, well, thank you all very much for joining. Hopefully that was really helpful and gave you a bit of a good understanding of what's happened in both the federal and ACT budgets. Really appreciate you joining, appreciate your questions. This has been recorded and we'll get this up online and share with you if you want to watch back, and I will share all of the notes that we have as well. We have detailed notes with all those stats. Expect that email maybe in the next week or so you can see all the data that underpinned everything. Thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day.